In the middle of the Australian desert, there's a hole so big you can see it from space. Trucks the size of houses crawl along its edges. They don't carry gadgets or cars or software. They carry rocks, red dirt, iron ore, the kind of stuff most countries trip over and ignore. Yet somehow that dirt helped turn Australia into one of the richest nations on earth. This is a country with just 26 million people, smaller population than Texas, far from everything. No ancient empire, no manufacturing powerhouse like Germany, no Silicon Valley, and still Australians rank among the wealthiest people alive. So how did that happen? Because right now, as the global economy feels fragile and unbalanced, Australia looks like a paradox. High wages, expensive homes, stable banks, decades without a recession. It almost feels suspicious. The story begins long before the skyscrapers of Sydney. In 1788, when the British arrived, Australia wasn't seen as an opportunity. It was a punishment, a distant penal colony, a place to send convicts. The land was harsh. Farming was unreliable. Isolation was extreme. For decades, survival was the goal. Then wool changed everything. By the mid-1800s, Australian sheep were producing some of the finest wool in the world. Britain's factories needed it. Ships filled with fleeces sailed to London. Money flowed back. The colony started to look less like a prison and more like a business. Then came gold. In the 1850s, gold discoveries triggered a rush. Thousands poured in, towns exploded overnight. Wealth accumulated fast. Australia's population multiplied, infrastructure followed, railways, ports, banks. The pattern was set early: find something in the ground, sell it to the world. But wool and gold were just the opening act. Fast forward a century. After World War II, Australia was still relatively small. Its economy depended heavily on farming. It was comfortable but not extraordinary. Then Asia woke up. In the 1960s and 72nd, Japan began rebuilding at breathtaking speed. Steel mills roared, factories expanded, but Japan lacked raw materials. It needed iron ore, coal, gas. Australia had all three. Massive deposits in Western Australia, particularly around places like the Pilbara, were suddenly worth billions. Companies like BHP began digging at industrial scale, or was shipped across the Pacific in enormous bulk carriers. This wasn't just trade, it was symbiosis. Japan industrialized, Australia supplied the ingredients. Then, history repeated itself but bigger. In the early 2000s, China entered its supercharged growth phase. Cities rose from farmland in years. Highways stretched across provinces. Hundreds of millions moved into urban life, and cities are made of steel. Steel is made from iron ore and coal. Guess who had it? By 2005, 2010, 2015, ship after ship left Australian ports loaded with raw materials bound for China. At one point, China was buying more than a third of Australia's exports. Iron ore alone became a lifeline. Prices surged, government tax revenues ballooned. Mining towns became boom towns, wages in the resource sector soared. Here's where it gets interesting. Australia didn't just get lucky with resources. Plenty of countries have oil or minerals. Many of them remain poor. The difference was the system. Australia had strong property rights, stable politics, independent courts, transparent financial markets. When mining companies invested billions in new projects, they trusted the rules wouldn't change overnight. That trust is boring. It doesn't make headlines, but it compounds. Foreign capital flowed in, infrastructure expanded, ports deepened, rail lines stretched thousands of kilometers to connect mines to the coast. The country effectively turned geography into a business model. Dig, ship, repeat. But the real magic trick wasn't just selling rocks. It was what Australia did with the money. In the 1980s and 92nd, the government undertook major economic reforms. It floated the Australian dollar, deregulated banks, opened up trade, reduced tariffs. It allowed its currency to rise and fall with commodity prices instead of artificially fixing it. That sounds technical. It's actually simple. When commodity prices boom, the Australian dollar strengthens, imports become cheaper, inflation pressure eases. When prices fall, the currency weakens, making exports more competitive. The Exchange rate becomes a shock absorber. Many resource-rich countries don't have that flexibility. They peg currencies, they overspend during booms. When prices crash, their economies implode. Australia built buffers. There's also something uniquely Australian: compulsory superannuation. In the early 1990s, the government required employers to contribute a portion of wages into retirement funds for workers. Over decades, this created one of the largest pension pools in the world relative to population. Today, Australia's superannuation funds manage trillions of dollars. That money doesn't sit idle. It invests globally in infrastructure, in equities, in private markets. So while Australia sells raw materials, it also owns pieces of the world. It's an elegant loop: export commodities, collect profits, channel savings into long-term investment, and for nearly 30 years, it worked astonishingly well. From 1991 to 2020, Australia avoided a technical recession. That's almost 3 decades of uninterrupted growth. The global financial crisis hit in 2008. Banks collapsed in the US and Europe, yet Australian banks remained relatively stable. The government had room to stimulate. China was still buying iron ore aggressively. The country looked almost charmed. But here's the uncomfortable math. Australia's wealth is heavily concentrated into areas: mining and property. Mining drives export income. Property drives domestic wealth. As mining boomed, wages rose. As wages rose, house prices climbed. Cheap global interest rates after 2008 poured fuel on the fire. Australian cities, like Sydney and Melbourne, became some of the most expensive housing markets on earth. Household debt surged. At times, Australian households carried debt levels among the highest in the world relative to income. It didn't feel dangerous because employment was strong and commodity money kept flowing. But it created fragility. When your national income depends significantly on one customer, China, you are exposed to its mood swings. When your household wealth depends heavily on ever-rising property values, you are betting on confidence, and China has slowed. In recent years, Chinese property developers have struggled. Construction growth cooled, iron ore prices became volatile, political tensions between Canberra and Beijing flared. Trade restrictions appeared on some Australian exports like wine and barley. Iron ore largely continued flowing because China still needs it. But the dependency was exposed. Australia began talking more about diversification: technology, education exports, tourism, critical minerals for renewable energy. There's irony here. For years, critics warned of Dutch disease: the idea that resource booms hollow out other industries by pushing up wages and currency values. Manufacturing shrinks, the economy becomes narrow. Australia did see manufacturing decline as mining expanded. Services grew instead. Universities attracted international students. Cities became financial and educational hubs. But the core engine remained the same: red dirt in Western Australia. And now the world is changing again. The global push toward decarbonization could reduce long-term coal demand. Iron ore remains critical for steel, but new technologies may alter supply chains. At the same time, Australia sits on vast reserves of lithium and other minerals needed for batteries and electric vehicles. It might be another chapter of the same story. Dig, ship, repeat, just different minerals. Yet the stakes are higher. Climate policy pressures fossil fuel exports. China's growth model is shifting. Global supply chains are becoming more politicized. The era of frictionless trade feels less certain. Meanwhile, at home, housing affordability is a political flashpoint. Younger Australians face prices that seem detached from reality. If property values stagnate or fall meaningfully, the wealth effect reverses. This is the tension. Australia is wealthy, incredibly so on a per-person basis. It has strong institutions, deep savings pools, a floating currency that absorbs shocks, strategic geography close to Asia's growth centers. But its prosperity still rests on geology and global demand. It is, in many ways, a highly sophisticated quarry with world-class governance. That sounds reductive. It's also partly true. The country mastered the art of being a reliable supplier to fast-growing Asian giants. It didn't squander the windfall through chaos or corruption. It built pension funds, maintained rule of law, let markets adjust. That's why Australia got rich, not just because it had resources, but because it had resources plus institutions. The question now isn't how Australia became wealthy, it's whether the formula scales into the next era. If China slows further, if decarbonization accelerates, if property cools, does the system adapt again? Or does the reliance on commodities and housing finally catch up? History suggests Australia adjusts. It pivoted from wool to gold, from gold to iron ore, from Britain to Japan, from Japan to China. Each time, the ships kept leaving port, but the desert hole is still there. The trucks still crawl along its edges. The wealth still depends on what lies beneath the surface. And that raises a quiet, uncomfortable thought. What happens when the world no longer needs what's in the ground?